Hi guys, here with your history for today. We're looking at King Alfred the Great today, and we're going to look at being able to explain events in the rule, so the time he was king. So we're going to look at how he came to be king, and the events leading up to it, and the things he did as king that gave him the title the Great. It's the year 871. The Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons are at war, and Ethelred, the King of Wessex, has been killed fighting the Viking invaders. The nobility must decide who the next king should be. Now, normally, when a king or a queen in modern times passes away, it's the oldest child that takes their place. This hasn't always been the case through history, but traditionally, that's what should have happened. So we've got some debate going on here. My lords, Ethelred is dead, and we're still at war with the Viking invaders. We must choose a new king quickly. So the Anglo-Saxons needed someone to lead them and their armies in the fight against the Vikings. And they needed this person quickly, because what can happen is there's not someone there to rule, everything gets disorganized, the organized efforts to defeat the Vikings go to nothing. So by having a new king, you can carry on with this organization. The plans are still there. You've still got someone to lead the army. I propose Ethelred's eldest son, Aethelwald. He's the obvious choice. So as I was saying earlier on, it's generally the oldest child of the previous king. So as that king passes away, or queen, as it would be today, passes away, the oldest child takes over. So in this case, it would be his oldest son, Aethelwald. He's the obvious choice. But Aethelwald is young, no more than a boy. We're at war. We need a grown man to lead us. So we've got a debate going on now between the nobles and saying, but well, yes, Aethelwald should be king, but he's too young. He can't lead in battle. You need someone who's more grown, who's seen more of the world, who's strong enough to survive a fight. It's no good sending a boy to fight against a man, because 99.9 times out of 100, the man's going to win and you're going to need another king next week, which is not what you want when you're at war with the Vikings. You want someone who is strong enough to be there to lead the fights. That's why they're looking for a grown man to lead them. The next question, and who, my lord, would you suggest? So we need to have an idea of who they're going to suggest. Alfred, Ethelred's brother. So Alfred is still royal. He's still part of the royal household. But instead of it being a line down through the family, going from father to son and so on, it's going to go sideways to the king's brother. Not Alfred. Alfred's weak. He's always ill. He won't survive. So we've got this argument going now. Well, I want this person, but they're too young. Well, how about this person? They're not strong enough. They're always sick. But they're saying he's not going to survive. So the debate carries on. It's true that Alfred is often ill, but he's not weak. So he's got a strength, whether it's a physical strength or whether it's up in his mind. He can think a problem through and come to a unique solution that'll mean they'll be able to defeat the Vikings. Alfred is not a true warrior. He would prefer to spend his time reading books than preparing for battle. Now, if you think about the Anglo-Saxon times, it's all about beating the next invader or taking over the next place and being the invader yourself. So you need to be a warrior. Now, what they mean by a true warrior is someone that eats, sleeps, and breathes fighting. They're permanently training with different weapons, exercising, improving their skills, making sure they've got the strength to defeat any opponent that stands in front of them in battle. Alfred, they're saying, is not a true warrior because he'd rather read. Now, our debate's going to carry on. We must have kings who can read as well as lead us into battle. Our new king should be Alfred. So the argument is that it's all well and good being able to fight, but you need someone who's got the intelligence to know when to fight and when to sit down and talk to the opposing army and say, look, we could stand here and beat each other into the mud for the next 3 days, or we can come to an agreement and we can solve our problems by talking them through. So fighting's not always the answer. Alfred was in his early 20s when he became king. And it was true, he was often ill, but he certainly wasn't weak. His greatest challenge came from the Vikings who had invaded in the north and were moving south. So we remember the Vikings came across from Scandinavia. They sailed across the North Sea. They landed in Norfolk and areas up north. And they've slowly worked their way down Britain. They've taken over the other kingdoms. They've beaten the other kings. You remember the Anglo-Saxons divided Britain into 7 separate kingdoms. Alfred is the last king in Britain of Wessex. So he's fighting for the Anglo-Saxon way of life. They're the last piece of Anglo-Saxon life in England or Britain at the time. King Alfred, the Vikings are advancing again. We can't beat them. They're stronger than us. They have better weapons. We're outnumbered. This could be the end. So the warnings come. The Vikings are coming again. We can't beat them. They're stronger. They've got better weapons. Remember, we looked at their weapons in our last lesson. The different things and tools they used, the battle axes, the bearded axes, the hand axes, the say axes, the swords, the spears, the armor they had, the helmets and chainmail, the shields they used that locked together to create a shield wall and protect them with the spears poked over the top. We're outnumbered. There's more Viking warriors than there are Anglo-Saxon warriors. Now Alfred's got a problem. What's he going to do? He thinks, time. If only we had a bit more time to gather our strength. We just need a bit more time. So what he's thinking is, I've got the men, I've got the materials, I've got the equipment to beat the Vikings, but I don't have the time now to organize that. So he needs to find a way of getting that time, gathering up the armies, the equipment, the weapons, the structure behind it to make sure the army can fight. And all he needs is one last thing, time. So to give himself time, Alfred very cleverly made a deal with the Vikings. Now you could argue that because he read a lot and he was an intelligent man, he could see both sides of the argument for a fight. Well, if we stand and fight, we'll prove that we're not going to back down. But if we lose, the Vikings take over and the Anglo-Saxon way of life is gone. If I can talk to the Vikings, come to a deal with them, come to an agreement, then I can get the time I need. I can build the army I'm looking for. So Alfred cleverly made a deal with the Vikings. He gave them money in return for not attacking. They called that money the Danegeld, which I think roughly translates to Dane gold. So they would have given them gold. Basically, if I pay you, you leave me alone, and we'll all go along with our lives. The Vikings left Wessex in peace for a while. But then in 878, the Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Alfred. So a surprise attack, no one's expecting. You don't have time to prepare for it. So again, we need to think, and Alfred's going to need to think, how am I going to react to this? Alfred went into hiding. So rather again than standing there and being battered across the battlefield and losing, Alfred and a small group of his followers hid in a village surrounded by marshes. There's no king to kill. You can't win. So the idea is the Vikings would have turned up, found the king and killed the king, and then taken over Wessex for their own. If there's no king to take, they're not going to be able to do that. Alfred was disguised as a poor man, so the people had no idea the king was living in their village. Now, I don't know about you, but I can imagine if I was an Anglo-Saxon person living in a village and a Viking turned up and said, I have a purse of gold here. There's 100 gold pieces to the man that tells me where the king is. I'd be very, very tempted to say, that's him over there. Now, by disguising himself as a poor person, no one knew he was the king. Kings traditionally would have had a crown and fine clothing. Alfred would have dressed himself in rough woolen clothing and looked like an ordinary person. If he'd have had a beard, he might have taken it off, or he would have just got it covered in dirt and muck, so he looked like a working person. Remember the Anglo-Saxon times, and from our non-chronological reports, you had the different layers of society. You had the nobility at the top, you had your working man in the middle, and you had your thanes, your slaves at the bottom. He would have disguised himself as a working man, someone in the middle of society. There were lots of people like that. He would have disappeared quite easily. And remember, there was no smartphones, there was no internet, there was no newspapers, there was no magazines, there was no TikTok. So there wouldn't have been videos and photographs shared all around of what the king looks like. There'd be no paparazzi waiting outside the mud hut he was living in. Come and see where our king is now, splashed across the magazine pages. It was much easier in those days to just change your clothes, maybe shave your beard off, cut your hair, and you could disappear quite easily because not everybody was concerned about what you were doing. There's a famous story about Alfred, and it tells of him being told off by a woman for allowing her cakes to burn. Now, when you think about it, it depends on which point of view you're looking from. The woman is thinking, I've only got enough ingredients to make these cakes once. They'll feed my family for the next 2, maybe 3 days. Alfred is busy thinking about how to defeat the Vikings. He's got the weight of the country on his shoulders. He's trying to decide, how do I go about beating the Vikings? Do I fight them in an all-out battle on a field somewhere? Do I try and sneak up on them and take over their land? But he was so busy thinking, he's allowed the cakes to burn. The woman's come back probably thinking, you had one job to do, not let my cakes burn. I now can't feed my family. So it's an interesting take on the perspective of each person involved. For Alfred, the cakes aren't very important. He's trying to defeat the Vikings. For the woman, the cakes are the most important things because she's trying to feed her family. So this is a very famous story that goes along with King Alfred. After much planning, Alfred was ready to leave the marshes. He took off his disguise and dressed once more as king. So he emerged from this village, shed his poor clothes, and put back on the fine clothes he would have worn, the furs, the crown, would have washed and tidied himself up, and suddenly emerged as a member of the nobility once again. And from all over Wessex, people came to join him, ready to fight the Vikings. So the common man joined up. And you remember we had the Frid, the army of the commoner, that was there ready to be called on by the thanes, by the nobility. They've turned up ready to beat the Vikings, to send them back, to keep their lands safe. The Vikings, of course, turned up. Shields, spears, swords, still no horns on the helmets, I would like to point out. They didn't exist, as we all well know. The Vikings turned up ready to fight. Soon after, at the Battle of Edington, Alfred and his Anglo-Saxon army defeated the Vikings. Guthrum, the Viking leader, promised he would never attack Wessex again. In return for this, Alfred gave the Vikings land in the east of Britain, which became known as the Danelaw. Now, we've touched on this before when we were talking about the Vikings. And there was a big chunk of the east of Britain that was red, which was the Danelaw. Danelaw was the money that was paid earlier. And Wessex was at the bottom. Wessex was the last standing kingdom from the Anglo-Saxon times. The Vikings had come in from the north and swept south through Britain, and Wessex was the last place the Anglo-Saxons had. So this is an artist's impression of what Alfred looked like. He doesn't look like a particularly weak or even ill person. He looks like a king. He's got his crown, he's got his fine robes. Looks like a real leader. So while Alfred may have been ill for much of his life, he is remembered as one of the strongest kings. And an interesting bit of trivia here. So as you get older, you might find in a quiz somewhere, this question will come up and you'll be able to say, I remember doing this in history. He's the only English king to be given the title Great. So he is known as King Alfred the Great because he fought so well against the Vikings. He outthought them. He approached the battle with them in a different way. The first time round they turned up, he paid them money. The second time, he went and hid, knowing he still needed time to raise his army. The third time, they took the fight to the Vikings and they beat them. So your task for today, you're going to create a comic strip of the 6 key moments in Alfred's life. So you'll need your piece of paper and you're going to split it. 6 boxes, that's how many you need. Each box should contain a picture and a brief description of the event. Sequence the events in chronological order. So I've started off. In 871, Alfred was made King of Wessex following the death of his brother. And then you can go back through our lesson today, the important parts from each one. Which ones were you going to choose? So we need 6. So we need to think about what we've talked about. We've talked about the Danegeld, the Vikings turning up to attack and being paid to leave. The Vikings launching a surprise attack and Alfred going into hiding. The cakes burning. Alfred returned from hiding and beat the Vikings. The Vikings were told Alfred they'd never attack again and they were given Danelaw. So those could be the 6 items you need. So we need a picture to go with it and a brief description. That's your task for today. I look forward to seeing your work on Tapestry as always. Take care, stay safe, and we will see you again very soon.